Okay, folks, so last week we just had one lecture starting our series on reproductive tissue and flowers. And so this week we're going to focus on angiosperms and complete flowers. So I have one video on complete flowers and then the next video on incomplete flowers, as well as a little bit about pollination. So before we get started, I have a trivia question for you. Who was the winner of the 2004 Nobel Peace Prize for starting a program empowering local communities to plant trees? So if you thought it maybe was Mr. Beast last year, you would be incorrect. Dr. Wangari Maathai of Kenya is the founder of the Green Belt movement, and she founded this to address poverty and environmental issues. And she was also a professor at the University of Nairobi. And went on to serve as Assistant Minister for Environment and Natural Resources for Kenya. And so this tree planting program, right, instead of just coming in and planting trees as we're going to do this for you, she empowered the local communities to improve their local environment. And so that was how she made a difference. So really pretty impactful program that continues to this day. So that's Wangari Maathai from Kenya. So quick lecture outline. So this first lecture is about angiosperms and flowers. And today we're going to look at complete flowers and flower parts, so the flower morphology. If you found some of the terms that I used in the last lecture a little bit confusing, those should be cleared up today. And we'll have some hands-on practice for you to learn each of those, lots of that vocabulary for that. And then we'll talk also a little bit about flower evolution and evolution of floral parts. So starting with angiosperms, right, we talked about this on the first day of class, but when we're focusing on flowers, right, we're talking about reproductive shoot. And so in this case, consists of a twig plus specialized leaves of angiosperms. So angiosperms, remember, are flowering plants. If you break down the word into the roots, angio and sperm means covered seed. And so angiosperms are plants that bear seeds that are inside of an ovary. So that's what we mean by covered seed. And these evolved after gymnosperms, which we'll talk about next week. But these are the most highly evolved and most successful plants. And so what do we mean by that? 88% of the plant kingdom is made up of angiosperms. So just diversity alone, most plants are angiosperms. And so gymnosperms, just to review, the root words are gymno and sperm, and so that means naked seed, and we'll talk about those next week. So if we're talking about flowers and flowering plants, so the function of a flower, right? Flowers produce and disperse seeds. And why is that an advantage, right? So if you have genetic recombination and sexual reproduction, so you have male and female gametes coming from different plants, that sexual reproduction and recombination of genetic material tends to produce superior plants, right? Higher genetic diversity, which can cope with changes in the environment. So you're more likely to have a plant or offspring that is able to tolerate some of those conditions that are challenging. And when we look at flowers, they have four basic parts. So the first part is the gynecium. And lots of textbooks still call this the pistil, but the gynecium is the female parts, right? And a gynecium is made up of one to many carpels. So don't get stuck on that. We'll come back to that in just a minute. The second basic flower part is the andrecium, which used to be called the stamen. So this is all of the male parts of the flower. In this case, it consists of the anther with pollen sacs that carry the sperm. And then we have petals. So these are the colorful parts of flowers that help pollinators find them. And then we have sepals, and their function is to cover or protect the flower parts while they're still in bud. So it keeps flowers from freezing too early. When we're talking about complete flowers, like we are in this lecture, those are flowers that have all four of those parts of the flowers. So gynecium, andrecium, petals, and sepals. The more primitive plants in evolutionarily have complete flowers. So the more primitive the angiosperm, the more likely it is to have all four of those parts. So let's look at those parts in a little bit more detail and look at flower morphology. So This could be review, and it could be some material that you had recently, or it could be material that you had a long time ago. So we'll spend a little bit of time reviewing just to make sure that you remember all these different parts. So let's look at each of these in turn. So if we look at those 4 parts, right, we have the petals up here in the pink, and then we have the sepals and underneath in green. The male parts of the andrecium consist of these parts called the stamen, right? So the collection of these 6 stamens in this floral diagram. And in this case, we have 1 gynecium consisting of 1 carpel that's here in green in the center. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail, first starting with the female parts, the gynecium. So remember, the gynecium can be made of 1 to many carpels. And when we're talking about the carpel here at this diagram on the bottom, we're talking about 3 main parts: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So the stigma is at the very top of the carpel, and that's where the pollen lands. So it's sort of a landing spot for pollen. It's often sticky to collect pollen. And then the style is the part that's just below the stigma. So this long tube here is often, its function is to sort out pollen that's from other plants. Sometimes it will not recognize or allow pollen of the same flower to grow there. And then at the very bottom is where we have the ovary, right? So the ovary contains ovules, right? So these are the egg cells. And once they're fertilized, those are what develop into seeds. So let's look at the male parts of the flower, right? The andrecium. So this consists of the stamens. Lots of textbooks still use the word stamens, and I think even the practice example we have uses stamens. So stamens are the male parts that contain the pollen. So that's the pollen is the male gametes or sperm that are used for fertilization. So when you look at the stamen here, this little diagram on the left consists of the anther, right, which is this roundish part or oval at the top that contains pollen sacs. So that's where the pollen is contained. And then the filament, which is the stalk that supports the anther. So inside of the anther, you can see those pollen sacs that are developing. And that's the basic structure of the andrecium, which consists of all the stamens on a flower. We can talk about these parts collectively, right, like the plural. And so if you're talking about all of the sepals in the flower, that's called the calyx. If you're talking about all the petals, that's called the corolla. And in fact, if you want to combine those things, right, all of the sepals and all of the petals, you can collectively call that the perianth. And so understanding these terms is important because if you're using a field guide or some other resource, it will talk about these different plant parts, and you need to understand what you're looking at if you're trying to identify something. And then review, andrecium is all the stamens together, and the gynecium is all the carpels together. So remember, our more primitive plants have all 4 of these parts, right? All of the sepals, the petals, the andrecium, and the gynecium. And so those flowers are called complete. We have a nice little diagram, cross-section of a photo of a plant showing all these different parts here, right? So just an example. So when we're talking about flower evolution, right? Some flowers are what we'd call highly evolved. They've changed a whole lot from their floral ancestors, but some families have not changed a whole lot, right? So flowering plants share a common ancestor, and some of them are more highly evolved than others. On the primitive end of the spectrum, we have families like Magnoliaceae, Lauraceae, Calycanthiaceae, and Ananaceae. These are more primitive floral families, and so some of the characteristics that they share, you can see they have many petals. If you're looking at this tulip tree flower on the right, which I hope you recognized, and also many stamens. So in fact, an indeterminate number of each of those. So there's not a set number of petals or stamens in these more primitive floral families. And just another note about these and their pollinators, most of the primitive species are insect or animal pollinated. So let's look at a couple of, and so you can see in this photograph of the tulip tree flower, you have your gynecium here in the center, surrounded by the andrecium, which is the male parts of the flower. And then we have the tepals, which are a combination of petals and petals and sepals that are surrounding that. And it's not a set number for any particular flower. Let's look at a couple of other examples. So these are the flowers that we don't get to see when we take dendrology in the fall of Calycanthus floridus. Sweet shrub or sweet Betsy, and Asemina triloba, the pawpaw, which has a really interesting flower on the right. And so those are some examples of the more primitive flower families. And when we're thinking about flower evolution, so on the other end of the spectrum, we have some families that are very highly evolved. And so there are more evolved flower structures that tell us that this has developed and evolved over time. So some of the characteristics that are found in more evolved flowers include a fewer number of flower parts and ones that are determined, right? So usually 5, and that's a set part, and that's an identifying characteristic. And then also floral structures like bilateral symmetry and fused petals. So I'm going to show you some examples of those so you can see what maybe some of these more advanced, more evolved plant families look like. So this is looking at, on the left, we have Fragaria, so that's wild strawberry. And on the right, we have Rosa multiflora. Both of these are plants in the Rosaceae family. And so on the left, you can see the Fragaria is a cross section, and you can see that some of the petals and sepals have been pulled off. But you can see the gynoecium here in the center, right? This is going to turn into the strawberry. And then you have the andrecium, the stamens around the outside. And then also on this Rosa multiflora, right? These are characterized by, they always have 5 petals. So that's something that you can count on. Same thing for strawberry. This is a pretty consistent characteristic for the Rosaceae. So that's, more evolved floral structure there. And then when we're talking about symmetry, bilateral symmetry, we have a nice example on the left of Robinia suoticacea, which is a species we learned early in the semester. And you can see on the right, this is a Cercis canadensis or Fabaceae flower, right? So Fabaceae flowers share a certain look. They have a bean or a pea kind of flower. And you can see that these petals are more highly evolved. So you have recognizable parts like the pedicels and the petals. Here you can see the pistil here in the stentor and the stamens that are also clustered in the middle. But instead, some of the petals are kind of fused or specialized. And so they look a little bit different. The symmetry is just a little bit different here. Again, also another character of a more evolved plant family is Ericaceae. So this is the heath family that includes our blueberries, also our sourwood flowers. And you can see in this case, you can see where the petals are there, but instead of being separate entities, they're fused together into these little urns. And those urn-shaped flowers, or urceolate flowers, are really typical of plants that are in the heath family. Really cool note here about pollination. You can see the bee hanging upside down on the oxydendrum flower. And you can see the oxydendrum flower, the little petals as they're apart at the bottom of the tubes are not especially good for this, but it's thought that a lot of those Ericaceae flowers have urn-shaped petals so that the nectar that's inside does not get diluted. You can see that those little urns hang down, and so that allows the nectar to stay concentrated inside and not get diluted by rainwater. And it's also thought that the little flared out bases of those flowers at the ends enable pollinators like bees to grab a place to grab onto when they're pollinating. So kind of a cool thing. And if you notice the fruits from sourwood, which you should have noticed in the lab, it's true of all Ericaceae that once those flowers are pollinated, the fruits develop and they actually point upright. So that's something that we don't quite know why that would be. Makes sense that for the flowers to hang down to keep the nectar concentrated, a little less certain as to why the developing fruits end up turning up, but that is true for sourwood. So just to wrap up really quick, angiosperms are flowering plants. And so these evolved after gymnosperms, but they are, and they're characterized by having covered seeds, seeds contained in ovaries. And this evolutionary mechanism has been very successful. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And so the vast majority of plants are angiosperms in terms of diversity. When we're talking about complete flowers, these are flowers that have all four of the basic parts. Four basic parts are sepals, petals, the andrecium, the male parts of the flowers, and the gynoecium, the female parts of the flowers. And we also see a trend that the more primitive plant families, the early angiosperms, have complete flowers that have all four of these parts. To review the andreciums, they consist of an anther with a pollen sac as well as a filament. And the gynoecium contain all of the female parts of the plants. And so they can have one to many carpels. We'll look at some practice examples of that. And the carpels, each carpel consists of a stigma, which receives the pollen, a style to sort out the pollen, and an ovary. And so that's a wrap on angiosperms. We will, or on complete flowers, we'll talk about examples of incomplete flowers in the next recording.